Peut-être qu'on se rapproche bien comme ça.
Non, pas du tout, c'est un micro très très sensible.
D'accord.
C'est même pas la peine de s'approcher.
Ok, parfait.
La pièce risque de s'entendre aussi, mais on va rester calme ici. Est-ce que tu peux parler un peu, Isabelle?
Oui, je vais présenter tout à l'heure.
Très bien. Et toi aussi?
Oui, bien sûr. Welcome everyone. Ni hao, guten tag, bonjour à tous.
On ne voit pas les sourires, dommage,
C'est
c'est
vrai.
dommage. Il est très
J'aurais
très
pu
haut ton
mettre-
masque.
Effectivement.
Peut-être un tout petit peu qu'on voit le bas de ton œil quand même. On ne fait pas allusion au Covid dans notre message, mais bon, ça se verra.
On en parle dans les issues d'ailleurs.
Donc, il y a 7 personnes connectées. J'accepte tout le monde.
Alors, en fait, il faut qu'ils patientent. Parce qu'il ne faut pas les mettre à l'antenne par contre. Hein. Vous pouvez les accepter, mais il ne faut pas qu'ils soient à l'antenne.
Oui.
Sur Zoom.
Oui, on peut les accepter. Ils vont comme ça.
D'accord. Donc, du coup,
En fait, tu pourras te décaler un petit peu plus.
Oui.
Voilà. On voit Beyond Frontiers.
Exactement.
donc Zoé, est-ce que tu es dedans? On est appuyé, voilà. Ça va, on est à 7 minutes passées, c'est compréhensible. Je pense que voilà.
Je vais essayer de raccourcir le discours pour rattraper en fait. D'aller un peu plus dynamique.
Vous voulez parler un peu?
Ok. Welcome everyone. Ni hao. Guten Tag.
Très bien, donc on va partir en live. Tout le monde prêt, point. Je regarde mon retour avant tout. C'est bon.
Welcome everyone. Ni hao. Guten Tag. Bonjour à tous. Dear Jean Jouzel. Dear Philippe Croison, our two honorary president. Dear Christophe Poinçon, Deputy CEO and Scientific Director of BioGM, our institutional partner and sponsor, and today our distinguished host. Dear sponsor MC2, Club CO2, B Zero Carbon, and Trustco by S&Ps. Dear partners, French Academy of Technologies and all academicians, the Carbon Disclosure Project, and the AFP Energy Nouvelle. Dear audiences, I'm Fabrice Sang, the founder of Climate Tech Venture and the co-chair of this CPC Carbon Pricing Conference, and I've got the great pleasure to have with me Dr. Isabelle Czanikowski-L'Oriol, Chief Research and Public Officer by BioGM. On these two special days, the 2 and 3 June has a very mix of roundtables, keynotes, fire chat, and indeed, startup highlighting, dedicated to the why, involving in the global model transformation from a new carbon-based model and how designing the future, how better understanding this net zero era to a better engagement beyond all the pledges. Supporting climate tech solutions also is a key point that we are going to address. And we will close the conference by a very special session, the Climate Tech Awards, a dedicated one to design the two early stage but promising one to support and accelerate. You're already more than 8,500 people who follow us in the link today, and we expected to tell it transparently, just 1,000 people. So we are very impressed and grateful that you are pushed in increasingly way the number of your attention. Much more than 8 times expected. You're right, indeed, because this topic drive all of us and concern all of us. From you, all around the world. Like a little village in this live stream, connected by this. We are here based in Paris, 5 years ago, after the Paris Agreement itself, and we want to synchronize much more than your time attention today. When it comes with climate and carbon issue, all of us have seen the series of pledges to be net zero. But indeed, in this net zero race, it's like an open hackathon. Let's say it like a marathon, where organizations, public and private, countries themselves are already planning a very ambitious new trajectory for the climate mitigation. By saying this, we, all of us, small and great actors, we should change our model. We should change our habits in this fast-track modus operandi, unexpected just 1 generation ago. And today, we have to make it just in 1 generation also. Then, to co-design it, we are very grateful for our 2 champions, let's say like this, for sustainability. Professor Jean Jouzel, former IPCC vice-chair and academician, as a scientific pioneer with Professor Claude Lorus, have the inspiration just to have a look on the polar ice studies and highlight the natural data center of the climate, and have paved the way also to contribute to the Paris Agreement much more than decades ago. We would like also to thank very much Philippe Croison, adventurer, author, entrepreneur of life, and advocate today to a more resilient and low carbon models, pushing the limit to highlight for the world and for the humanity and inspire us. Our also relevant editorial and scientific committee have powered this program by their inputs to prepare all the sessions. It is for you. And we are also grateful for our diverse lineup of speakers, from international to national representative, and expert from finance, from energy industries, from environment, public policies, and indeed entrepreneurs. And from different regions from the world, as you, the audiences. But before starting this CPC Carbon Pricing Conference, I would like again to make a great thanks to our sponsor, in particular the BRGM, where we are today, MC2, Club CO2, B0 Carbon, and True Cost by S&P. And for our partners, the French Academy of Technology, the Carbon Disclosure Project, and IFP Énergie Nouvelle. Thanks all of us for joining this fantastic and running project. From this framework, we are designing the CPC Carbon Pricing Conference like a milestone, today dedicated to climate and carbon issues, and to try to provide you a piece of work preparing Glasgow in next November for the COP26. And we'll address at the end of these 2 days to Alok Sharma, the chairman of Glasgow, COP26, and his steering committee, all our key points that we are going to highlight in all roundtables and keynote. Let's join force for this contribution. But before starting, I will let the floor to Dr. Isabelle Czarnikowski-Loyal, my co-chair for real complementary open message. And I'm very pleased, Isabelle,
Thank you, Fabrice. Slide number 5, please. Welcome to everybody. I am Isabelle Czarnirowski-Loriol, co-chair of the conference with Fabrice. I belong to BRGM, the French Geological Survey. BRGM is a partner of the conference and is very pleased to host the conference from its offices in Paris, close to the Eiffel Tower and the Seine River. As said by Fabrice, I met him by chance at a research and innovation event in Paris. We are both very motivated to help bring everyone together and converge on solutions to effectively achieve carbon neutrality and limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. Beyond pledges, we need now actions. There is no planet B. We have to imagine planet A prime. We were delighted to organize this conference together, step by step, taking advantage of our complementary backgrounds. Startup, Public Research Institute, fintechs, and climate techs, male and female. I am a research and public policy chief officer. I've been carrying out research into underground technologies for climate change mitigation, starting with geothermal energy, then specializing on CO2 capture and geological storage, the CCS technology. There will be a dedicated session 2.3 tomorrow. I've been also involved in the underground storage of energy. To face the climate change crisis, I would like to insist on 3 points. First, I believe that new technologies are key to face the climate issue. It is crucial to increase support for research and innovation on all technologies that can contribute to ensure carbon neutrality. The good news is that we have a wide set of innovative technologies that are emerging, and some are already ready to be tested and implemented. For each territory, we have to investigate with the local stakeholders the best combinations of technologies and solutions that are adapted to the specificities and the needs of the territory. They should be efficient, cost-effective, desirable, and deployed on time at the scale needed and as soon as possible. I am particularly looking forward to the Climate Tech Award ceremony closing the conference tomorrow under the honorary presidency of Philippe Croison. Philippe has done amazing sporting exploits and is an example of how to surpass oneself and collectively under very difficult circumstances. Second, public policies are also key. I wish to remind the words of Mariana Mazzucato, who is professor in the economics of innovation and public value at University College London. In her bestseller book, The Entrepreneurial State, she explains how the state has played a central role in producing game-changing breakthroughs, especially by actively investing in new, high-risk technologies and sectors that private investors only later find the courage to move into. She stresses that such role of the state is needed for the green revolution and for facing the climate issue, and that it must be accompanied by symbiotic public-private partnerships. Third, adequate financial tools and market mechanisms are needed to accompany the public policy and enable the rapid development, scale-up and deployment of innovative climate technologies. The 3 pillars, finance, climate techs and public policies, will be discussed during the conference with outstanding speakers from all over the world. Fabrice and myself wish to thank sincerely all the speakers for their involvement and all the attendees too. We believe that this conference will be an excellent way to share the current status of knowledge and know-how, and we hope that it will inspire us all together for our next actions, whatever our job, and as citizens. The convergence of all goodwill is necessary to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees C by acting now, all together, globally and locally, coherently, and with determination. So now, I am very pleased to introduce our Honorary President of the Carbon Pricing Conference, Jouzel, who is a famous French climatologist, as a member of the French, European, and US Academies of Science. He was vice chair of one working group of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change when IPCC received the Nobel Prize for Peace in 2007, along with US former Vice President Al Gore. Now you will look at the video with the message given by Jean Jouzel to welcome you all at the conference.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to say a few words at the opening of this carbon pricing conference. Which for me is very important because, as you know, I am a former vice chair of IPCC Group 1 and very interested in the challenge posed by this need to clearly limit the global warming, and I really adhere fully to the objective of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees C with respect to pre-industrial, and this is in the Paris Agreement, which states that the objective should be to limit global warming to well beyond 2 degrees C, and if possible around 1.5 degrees C. And it's clear that we are not far from 1.5 degrees C because the last 6 years have been very warm, the warmest that we have known since the last century. I mean, over the last 120,000 years, since the beginning of the last century. And it's clearly, when we look at what is a necessary condition to achieve this goal, to which I adhere, because it's the only way to make life easy for young generation. It's clearly necessary in this case to have carbon neutrality around 2050, and this was really a key result of the last IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees C. And in this report, 4 scenarios are presented which are compatible with this objective. But the most ambitious scenario is really without overshoot, which is very important. And in this case, we need really carbon neutrality 2050. And this carbon neutrality in this scenario, which are discussed in this IPCC special report, include both include carbon storage, carbon capture and storage, but also carbon reuse, and it's a large amount. It can be up to 1,000 gigaton of CO2, which is capture or for either reuse or to be stored, but it also called upon bioenergy CCS, which means combining the biomass, the use of biomass to produce energy with carbon capture and storage. This is not obvious to go ahead with this strategy because there is some competition between the use of land, between energy, the use for energy for BECCS, and the use for obviously needs of food. This is also a clear result from another IPCC report on land use, this competition between energy and food for the land. So this should be kept in mind. But what is important is, for me, is that it is clear that in this scenario, for which aims to keep climate around 1.5 degrees C with respect to pre-industrial conditions, there is a clear need for carbon capture and storage, again, with also part of it being reused, part of it being also a large part of it being combined with bioenergy, use of biomass for energy. Where are we at the moment? It's clear that it's not only an IPCC report, but up to now, there is, I think, 130, more than 130 countries around the world which have adopted this objective of carbon neutrality in 2050. This is true for the United States, it's true for Europe, but many other countries, Japan, South Korea, and Canada, I think Australia, and for China is 2060. But so this should be taken seriously, because it's clearly in the objective of this country, is also in the objective of our country to be neutral in carbon in 2050. And so it's important to think about carbon capture and storage as a tool for reaching this objective. And so I would like really to tell you that the importance of these 2 days for about net zero carbon emission, and so which is a common objective, and I encourage you to go ahead with discussion. This is a very serious and important topic. This being said, it is obviously important to limit the use of carbon capture and storage, and the best way to do it is to limit emissions, to decrease emissions very rapidly, and this will be necessary through, for example, really an energy mix which will be less emitting in carbon and obviously not with zero emission of carbon and energy mixed, and also sobriety in the use of energy and energy efficiency. This is very important. I mean, carbon capture and storage is only a complementary way to succeed in reaching this carbon neutrality, but obviously the best way to do it is to limit emissions themselves.
We thank very much Jean Jouzel for his strong message. It is a scientific voice that we need to hear to address effectively climate change.
Now, let's set the scene on 3 main issues. We are going to let the floor to 3 people in this way. The first issue is everything, everywhere we are connected by the climate, by the environment, by the biodiversity, by the land use, and the public earth. We have seen it recently. The second issue is also important. We need a crossing approach from countries, from companies, small and medium enterprise, and we also need much more regulation, much more decentralized applied public policy through states, through regions, through cities, and embedded also the civil society in this field. So let's come also with the third, but not least. How to bootstrap today a new sustainable deal or a sustainable new deal. It's quite the same, but how to make it in practice, like a rebirth of a public and private partnership. So we are very pleased to have and to share with you some keynotes with a great message to set the scene. And I let my co-chair introduce the first speaker for this.
So the first keynote will be given by Paal Frisvolt, who was recently appointed EU Climate Ambassador. So we are very much looking forward to his speech. Thank you, Paul, for being with us this morning in live through Zoom.
Thank you very much, Isabelle, and thank you, Fabrice, for giving me the occasion to be with you today and to listen to all the inspiring speakers and to try to contribute myself with some reflections, because Fabrice, I think you struck a very good tone in your opening statement when you said, how should we design the future and how can we support clean tech solutions? Well, you know, this has been a quite a year. In fact, I mean, it's we started with recently we had the report from the International Energy Agency. I am speaking to you from Norway, where I have taken refuge now in these COVID days, but I'm usually also based in Brussels, close to the EU institutions. But here in Norway, we are obviously in the forefront in petroleum, in oil and gas, but also in developing low carbon technologies like carbon capture storage and biomass and carbon capture and storage, like the professor just mentioned. But the IEA report was an eye-opener because it did set the scene and give us a very clear message. You know, many countries that are clinging to fossil fuel energy production has been very grateful for the IEA's mantra, which has been that the world needs more energy. Well, after the recent Net Zero 2050 report of the IEA, that is no longer the case, because the IEA has said, in addition to unleashing an enormous amount of production of renewable energies, that no more oil, coal, or gas fields should be opened after 2020 and 2021. This is a very strong message and a very important message. But the thing is, you know, that the IEA, with its authority in terms of competence and knowledge and information, has very little impact on the actual policy design of countries and regions. There are bases for inspiration, true, but a lot more needs to be done. So the other thing that happened this year, which is of great value, not only to reaching our climate mitigation targets, but also in terms of creating a high price of carbon, because that will obviously be important. That is the European Green Deal and the recent climate law that is being adopted in these days. There was recently a political agreement between the EU member states, the European Parliament, and the Commission on a climate law that will not only enshrine in law the goal of 55% carbon emission reductions by 2030, but also a trajectory towards 2050 to achieve climate neutrality in Europe, making Europe the first climate neutral continent in the world. And that law is a milestone, and it will have an enormous impact, I'm sure. But let me just say that what the EU Green Deal is trying to achieve is also more than a price mechanism. A price mechanism is the core of our climate policy, but we have seen the rigidity and the difficulties in making the green transition in other industries. That is why the EU Green Deal has a lot to offer. Now, I shall not go into all of them. There's a huge package that will be unleashed now on the 14th of July on the French national holiday. Not something specific about that, but that is the date where the Commission will present the Fit for 55, the legislation that will be adopted to ensure that the EU countries are fit for reducing climate greenhouse gas emissions by 55% within 2030. But there is one element that I think is key here, and which I think will become a very important driver, and that is the sustainable finance project of the European Union, which is often referred as taxonomy, a terrible technical word, but nevertheless an important tool. And in very brief, let me just say that, you know, capital flows to where they gain the most return. But the taxonomy will open up another measure for capital to achieve return on investment. And this is very important, because if the ministers of finance and the banking and the finance world will receive very clear guidance and clear rules of how to measure return on capital, then that will make a change. Today, the world has many specific rules for emissions of CO2, of NOx, of other dangerous substances, but the finance sector has been let alone. They have not been subject to the same rules. Well, the taxonomy rules will do something about that. Every investment will be measured towards how much CO2 emissions it will reduce, how much any activity will lead to adaptation to climate change, how every activity will lead to a more circular economy, to reduce pollution, to biological that we have a cleaner and we get back our nature back. And last but not least, that the seas and the oceans will become cleaner. So this will have a tremendous effect. Now, finally, let me just mention that the low carbon technologies will play a role here, because, as Isabel mentioned, there are some sectors that are hard to abate. There are some sectors like steel, cement. There is also aluminum, fertilizer, etc., where it is difficult to replace the molecules, the CO2 molecules, with renewable energy. So we then need to use hydrogen as an energy carrier that will allow them to reduce its carbon emissions. And that's why the EU is in this package now proposing a way to, because Isabel mentioned it has to be economically viable. And how do we make this expensive technology today economically viable tomorrow? And so there is a mechanism for a certificate trade that we hope can be the catalyst for a wider implementation of this important technology. Finally, let me just say that obviously the US new administration, its goal of becoming climate neutral by 2050. The Chinese government is also extremely important, as China is the world's biggest economic driver today. And the fact that China wants to be climate neutral by 2060 is a phenomenal achievement that we should welcome. And obviously the EU carbon border tax proposal, which is very controversial, has already shown, I believe, to have an impact, in the sense that it has mobilized initiatives from these countries that they want to be part of this global shift, of this global change. So Isabel and Fabrice, I just want to say congratulate you on an excellent initiative. I think it's very timely, and I'm glad to see that you are bringing speakers and participants from all over the world, because this is truly a global challenge and a global issue. And I'm really proud to present to you some of the key elements of what the EU is doing, because I think the EU, with its rule-based policies, will be important to ensure that we obtain the kind of changes that we have. So that's all for me from now. Thank you. Back to you.
Thanks. Thanks a lot, Paal, for setting the scene and be the introducer to make it. Thanks for sharing your point of view as the EU climate ambassador now, and push forward the limit not only on the regulation but the practical challenges on the technologies that we need. So thanks a lot, and yes, just keep in touch and follow all the conference and the session. I'm sure that we could share a lot after the conference, and very thanks a lot again. Thanks, Paal. I would like now to introduce another key top-level speaker. Dr. Pradeep MONGA. He is the former Deputy Executive Secretary to combat desertification at UNCCD. And he's also the former Director of the Energy and Climate Change, UNIDO. So we are going to have a pitch pre-registered from Pradeep MONGA, and he's going also to contribute to set the scene all together. So just share with you his message. So it's running. Yes, we are here.
Good morning, colleagues, friends. Let me begin by thanking organizers, especially Fabrice and Isabel, for inviting me to this very important global conference on the theme Carbon Pricing for Sustainable New Deal. Friends, colleagues, this conference is happening at a very critical juncture, a critical time when all of us are preparing for very successful outcomes at COP26. We are in midst of a climate emergency. We are in a situation in which, unless and until we take urgent and collective actions on all fronts to mitigate or halt impacts of climate change and avoid potentially irreversible environmental damage resulting from it, we'll cross that tipping point after which we won't be able to save ourselves, our present, our future, and of course, our planet. I'm very delighted to be part of this opening session, which is focusing on three key themes, namely, everything, everyone is connected. A crossing approach is needed to address climate change. And of course, we need a sustainable New Deal if we want to move ahead now at this stage to address climate change. Let me expand all these three themes one by one. First, in my view, everything, everyone is connected everywhere. Let us reflect it in the context of ongoing COVID pandemic and of course, relationship linkages with climate change. For instance, deforestation induced by climate change, droughts, heat waves, bushfires have led to destruction of natural habitats of wildlife all around the world. Along with illegal wildlife trade has led to closer contact between humans and wildlife, resulting in zoonosis, a natural situation where wildlife-induced virus diseases could jump from animals, birds to humans. This is a perfect example of natural storm, a storm where climate change-induced habitat loss related factors have resulted to spread of a catastrophic worldwide pandemic, COVID pandemic around the world for almost last 1.5 years. Nobody is safe from COVID pandemic unless everyone is safe everywhere. And similar is true about adverse impact of climate change. Nobody will remain unaffected from climate change unless climate change is addressed every part of the world. Second, addressing climate change would need a crossing approach, an approach which means that we require integrated and holistic economic regulators, businesses, and civil society all together. Civil society including communities, NGOs at every level, global, regional, national, and local level. That is their collective action that can connect the dots and address climate change together with biodiversity loss and land degradation collectively. Sustainable New Deal would mean require going beyond discussions and pledges and getting into concrete actions. Implementation of an ambitious global agenda to promote nature based solutions, clean energy, for green jobs, green habitats, green cities, green transport systems, and above all, adopting sustainable way of lifestyles that will have everlasting impact. It's time to connect globally and, of course, take action locally. Here, let me highlight a very important aspect that we often miss out or we do not give importance it deserves in our discussions, including this conference, in our approaches, in our actions while addressing adverse impact of climate change. And this aspect is, this missing link is close connectivity between climate change, biodiversity, and land agenda. We try to deal with all these three issues in silos, in compartments. And this is where it becomes very complex issue. For instance, looking at land, land is foundation of all life on Mother Earth. It is a basis for supporting ecosystem services, including food, water, energy, and of course our health. Land is also a very important economic asset and the primary source of livelihoods for almost 80% of population in developing world. But it also land land is also very important, significant GHG greenhouse gas emission sector as well as acting as a sink. For example, after energy sector, land use sector is a significant contributor of greenhouse gas emissions. The agriculture, forestry, and other land uses together form the largest GHG emitting sector after energy systems, accounting almost for 24% of total emissions, which comes to around 10 to 12 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. At the same time, land also acts as carbon sink. Organic soil organic carbon store more than double the carbon, almost 2,500 GT, gigaton plus, which is more than atmospheric at 830 gigatons and biomass 576 gigaton together. Once land gets degraded, the soils get degraded, this soil organic carbon gets released back to atmosphere and that can have more further catastrophic impact on us. Land is also under unprecedented pressure from all sides in any part of human history. As I speak today, over 25% of global land is degraded due to human actions and natural factors, especially impacts induced by climate change. Over 12 million hectares of productive land, agricultural land, is getting degraded every year. And if we link to our food security, we'll require, in addition to reverse the degradation, we require 300 million hectares of productive land to produce more food for the population increase if we go up to 2030. And that will have many folds increase in food production if we look at 2050 when population may touch 9 billion. Investing in lands means investing in climate mitigation, climate adaptation, reversing biodiversity loss, On economic terms, investing in soil organic carbon is most economic way of carbon sequestration, acting as carbon sink, in addition to multiple impacts of food security, water conservation, and of course, ecosystem restoration. It is time that we start looking at things in holistic way. We must break these silos and start addressing climate, biodiversity, and land degradation issues together an integrated way. And that becomes much more a norm, including this conference, wherever we discuss issues including carbon policies, carbon pricing, and carbon markets to really move forward with solutions, business solutions, company solutions, government solutions to address climate change on priority. When we talk about carbon policies, we must talk about ecosystem policies. When we talk about carbon pricing, we must also talk about ecosystem service pricing. They are all interrelated. And this becomes much more important at the national level, where we have different players, different actors, different policymakers dealing with the three topics together. To conclude, let me also refer to the outcomes of Dublin Climate Dialogues, a global event that was held on 19th-20th May in Dublin virtually to scale up ambition in run-up to critical COP26 summit. I have had the privilege to be associated closely with that event, basically as a member of steering committee, and I was very happy to see that many important recommendations are made as part of Dublin Declaration on how to turn net zero pledges into concrete energy policies and actions on the ground, and that we need to adopt at COP26 to move forward to strengthen 2015 Paris Agreement. These recommendations, among others, included many path-breaking suggestions, pragmatic suggestions, including emphasis on renewable energy-powered rapid electrification of global economy, where solar and wind will play a very important role, phasing out of fossil fuels, decarbonization of energy systems, rapid introduction of global reporting and accounting measures to best reflect the potential impact of climate risk to countries, communities, and of course to companies, delivery of public policy pathways that will enable countries to accelerate their transition to net zero by 2050 or even earlier, and of course a solid commitment to enable cross-border solutions, including putting a strong price on carbon. And that's where this conference comes in. The introduction of national and international carbon price floors and other mechanisms, which become very relevant as business models. While closing, let me once again emphasize the fact that addressing climate change effectively would require an integrated approach, including renewed focus on policy, financial, and of course, capacity building, incentives, actions to connect the dots. We need to address climate change, biodiversity loss, and land degradation collectively to address them on all fronts. It is about us, about our health, about our lives, our jobs, and most importantly, our ecosystems, our life support ecosystems that on which we depend for our survival, and of course, survival of our planet itself. Thank you so much for your kind attention.
Very impactful, very interesting, Dr. Pradeep MONGA, to contribute, set the scene with all the top level speaker. You have highlighted so much, and to put on the table the hard things, that everything on the front and surely on the background are connected, much more deeper than we think, usually daily, and the importance of the natural carbon sink to preserve. That is the way, the new pathway to land using to our based on our own activities, economic activities, and their impact. And it's very interesting that you introduce, in fact, the link and the connection to the biodiversity, which is not the new one, but as the COP26 going to run in the next November in Glasgow, there is an amazing synchronization on COP15 in Kunming dedicated on biodiversity. So by this way, we are going to follow up by a new speaker who's going to better design this issue on the biodiversity. As you said, Dr. Pradeep MONGA, when we talk about climate and carbon issues, we have also to talk about the carbon footprint or the biodiversity footprint. So for this, we are pleased to welcome Antoine Vallier. Antoine Vallier, he is an expert of biodiversity footprint. His job daily is in the branch.
Chris, we cannot hear you.
Okay. You can hear me?
Yeah, yes.
Okay,
Yes.
great. So Antoine Vallier, who is going to contribute on his field based on the Caisse de Dépôts and Consignation, the biodiversity branch. Do you hear us? So let's run it with Antoine Vallier.
Hello, everyone. Even a few years ago, it would have been difficult to talk about biodiversity during a conference about climate. So thank you very much for the opportunity. I think it's a very good sign that it's being more and more understood that climate change and biodiversity loss are two topics deeply interrelated. Maybe before I get to that point, I will start with the definition of biodiversity. The Convention on Biological Diversity defines it as the viability among living organisms from all sources, including inter alia, terrestrial, marine, and other aquatic ecosystems, and the ecological complexes of which they are part. This includes diversity within species, between species, and of ecosystems. So the last part of this definition clearly distinguishes three dimensions for biodiversity: the species, the ecosystems, and the genes. Most of the time when people think about biodiversity, they think about the first dimension. They think about the species. They think about pandas, bears, whales, all those emblematic species that often, unfortunately, are now endangered. Obviously, it is a very important dimension, but if you limit biodiversity to it, it might also be misleading. You might not be able to fully grasp what is at stake when we talk about biodiversity erosion. To fully understand what is at stake, you actually have to consider the second dimension of biodiversity, the ecosystems. The ecosystems are the functional entities of nature. They are the result of millions of years of evolution, and they provide essential services to humans. Maybe the best illustration of the services they provide is food production. Without the billions of insects working every day for free, we wouldn't be able to produce food because we wouldn't be able to pollinate plants. Another great service, and I get to my first point, is climate regulation. The biggest sink of carbon today are the natural ones: forests, oceans, soils. Without those, climate change would go much, much, much faster. And it works the other way around. Climate change is also a big contributor for biodiversity loss. And it will probably contribute more and more. When temperature rises by 1 or 2 degrees within 1 or 2 centuries, local species simply don't have enough time to adapt. So they perish. And we experience a transition phase, which can last thousands of years, where that's the time that it will take for new species to appear, to colonize those ecosystems with new living conditions. So thousands of years might not be such a long time when you relatively to the planet. lifespan, but for humanity, it will be a long way to go with degraded ecosystems and degraded ecosystem services that they provide. So it's really important to understand that you have a positive correlation between climate change and biodiversity loss. Recently, a study showed that Amazon forest, the biggest terrestrial sink of carbon, was actually probably a net contributor for carbon emissions during the past decades. And this is a very strong signal because it means that we actually are starting to lose the natural breaks that we have so far on climate change, and that we could experience an acceleration of the process, and we have to act quickly, otherwise this acceleration will quickly get us to a point of no return. Another service that nature provides is health. We know that living among healthy ecosystems provides many things that are essential to health: clean water, unpolluted air, food of good quality. Also, biodiversity is a great inspiration for medicine. Most of the molecules we today use are inspired by nature, and there are many more to be discovered that could be potential medicine for existing diseases or new diseases. And here again, it works the other way around. The more we destroy biodiversity, also the more we get into contact to new diseases. That's one of the message that has been raising with the recent pandemic is that actually the fact that we're destroying natural habitats get us closer to new diseases, new viruses, and this is part of the explanation why we have a frequency of large spread diseases which is increasing more and more. So the key message here is that health, climate change, biodiversity are all part of the same problem. You cannot solve one without solving the others. And the key, the way to success is a unified approach. So I think it's very interesting that we managed to talk about climate and biodiversity in this conference. I think it's very important as investors to understand that those physical risks, the dependencies we have on nature are material, and that those risks are getting more and more important. It's probably also important to understand that the related regulatory risks are getting more and more material. We are starting to see central banks trying to evaluate the biodiversity risk, because they understand that actually it can biodiversity loss can actually be a source of instability for the financial systems. Last week in France, a new law was published on ESG reporting, and investors are now asked to report on their risk related to biodiversity, and they have to clearly distinguish the risk linked to their impact and the risk linked to their dependence. So regulatory risk is now material as well. So it's time to act. I think we have the right knowledge, we have the right tools to do it. On an optimistic note, I would say that nature is very resilient. That we know that if we don't reach a certain tipping point, we will be able. Nature can bounce back quickly. So which means that if we act quickly, we will also see the results quickly, which I think is very encouraging. Thank you very much.
thanks, Antoine, Vallier, for sharing your point of view for this your institutional representative as you are, and talking on the importance of the biodiversity linked to carbon issue. So we are going to run now the first one series session dedicated to the name title of Carbon Pricing Conference, the carbon issue. But before it, we are going to just share with you this. Donc je vais faire la table ronde. Welcome everyone again, sharing this smart teaser with all of you. So we're going to run now this first session dedicated to carbon pricing, carbon market, carbon tax, and all the social acceptability also to discuss with this on the reform, on the new regulation that we have to drive in a new framework. Before running this first roundtable, we are going to share with you a message from Mickael from Massachusetts in US, dedicated to his point of view from the other side of the Atlantic. So let's please have the message of Mickael from Massachusetts.
Hello, everyone. My name is Mickael, and I am the executive director of an organization called Climate Exchange that's based in Boston, Massachusetts. And it's focused on state and regional climate policy across the U.S. With a keen focus on carbon markets and the designing and development of carbon pricing strategies. Lots to report out here of what's happening in the U.S. We're certainly excitedly watching some of the things that are happening at the subnational level. For those of you who aren't familiar, Washington State on our Pacific West Coast just announced that they're going to be moving forward with a cap and trade market, very similar to what has been passed and has been functioning in California now for some time. Now, Washington State will actually be one of the largest carbon pricing strategies and schemes here in North America. We also have seen very recently the announcement of a regional policy called the Transportation Climate Initiative that develops a cap and trade model carbon market for transportation fuels in the Northeast, so on the other side of the country from the great work that's happening in Washington State. Both of these policies really show that the US is interested and committed to moving forward with this, at least at the state and regional level. We know as well that there's also some opportunity and a lot of focus with our new administration. Lots of excitement. You can see the smile on my face that we have a complete change of tone down in Washington, D.C. from the previous administration, which I'm sure frustrated many. The Biden team now has been very cautious with how they move forward with their climate plan. There's a lot of excitement about the infrastructure strategy that they announced earlier in the year. It'll be a $2 trillion investment into R&D, technology development, and infrastructure rollout across the US with a keen focus on renewable energy. And this is really going to bring down the costs and spur innovation here in the US, which is really exciting to see happen. Now, we realize, though, that all of the innovation and the investments that the federal government wants to make isn't going to be enough if we want to meet our net zero targets by 2050. And some of our US state or subnational policies even call for a net zero policy by 2040. So we're certainly going to be watching the federal government and seeing how they move forward with thinking about a carbon border tax adjustment or a carbon market here in the US at the federal level. We realize as well a lot of policy is following the leadership that's already been set up by the private sector. So some of you may already be familiar with the LEAF Coalition. The LEAF Coalition, which was announced in the Climate Leadership Summit that was hosted on Earth Day here in the States by the Biden administration, pledged $1 billion into climate finance around forest preservation. And that's another great example where the private sector teaming up with government is really going to make a huge impact in how we think about not only carbon reduction strategies, but also forest management and development in our global tropic zones. Both this initiative as well as the new strategies at the US development entity known as USAID are going to be focusing their investments into different projects that not only help with global development, but help with global development in a low carbon neutral strategy. So there's a lot happening at the government level as well as within the private sector. Now, I do work for an entity in full disclosure called Carbon Capital Advisors, where I serve as a partner that's looking at investing into several of these carbon finance opportunities and carbon projects globally. One of the things that makes me really excited for why I'm working on these projects is the opportunity to be able to serve communities that previously we hadn't been able to reach through global aid, philanthropy, or carbon markets specifically. And that's, linchpinning off of the technologies of blockchain, as well as the new opportunities where communities that previously used to be way too impossible to reach out to now have access to the internet and have access to cell phones. And it's allowing us to create projects in places that previously weren't available, which is one thing that I'm really excited about. And the second piece that I'm really excited about that I hinted to is, of course, the new opportunities being brought about by technology. And looking at the new strategies around carbon accounting, how we can intertwine blockchain and different immutable ledger systems to guarantee not only that carbon is actually being saved, but also that over time, we're not seeing double counting or seeing projects that were maybe being stated that they're being retired, but actually are not. So there's lots of new ways that we can leverage new technology in order to make sure that we're actually creating real value to communities, but also real carbon savings. So those are just a few of the things that I am focused on. I would add as well that it's really important that we find ways to be collaborative. The US is coming back after a 4-year hiatus into climate leadership. I think our corporations have certainly been standing without the federal government over the last 4 years in this space. But it's really important for us to see policy opportunities and policy engagement coming to the forefront as part of the US initiative to addressing the global climate crisis. And one of the things that's been pivotal to the US political strategy to this point is engaging communities in the environmental justice sector. In a lot of the new strategies being designed by the current administration are actually being led by communities of color and by disenfranchised communities that have been previously left out of the conversation. That's what's going to make this time, this host of solutions, unique to what we've seen in the past, because that's really going to give it staying power. That's going to give it the community support and the community backing. That means no matter what future US administration is in charge, that communities are really going to continue to support and demand action. And that means that we're not going to see a change in the way the United States is leading in 4 years, but instead, a full national approach that is open to the world, that is going to be able to stand the test of time, as well as stand up to future administrations and really be something different. So we're happy to be back in fighting the climate crisis with you all, and really excited to be a part of this conference where we'll get to continue to talk about carbon pricing and the opportunities for an investment into a global transformation away from dirty fossil fuels. So with that, I turn it back to my panelists, and thank you so much for the time.
Mickael, from Boston, to share your point of view, what you achieved in US, in States, and also we do believe that the new Biden-Harris administration is really coming back seriously in this framework, and carbon pricing is a part of the new policy for a real recovery plan. Hopefully that it will be a green plan, not only from US, but also for different regions of the world. And I would like now to back to the very first roundtable, who's going to moderate by Dominique Vignon. Dominique is academician from the French Technology Academy, and he's going to run this first roundtable with Professor Jouzel from Wuhan University, and also with Richard Clark from Ortec Finance, based in UK. And the two and the three panelists are a great piece, an expert on the carbon pricing, dedicated on this field, and now update the roadmap in 2021. So pleased to welcome now Dominique Vignon from French Technology Academy, and Professor Jouzel from Wuhan University, and also Richard Clark. Hope you're here. Yes, I see you, Richard. Hi, Richard, and from UK. So, yes, Dominique, please, it's your turn, and I'll let you introduce the purpose.
Thank you very much, Fabrice. Thank you,
also to Isabelle for co-organizing and co-chairing this conference, and thank you for the invitation. So let me first introduce myself briefly. I'm an engineer and an economist by education, and I am a specialist in design, construction, operation of power plants, all types. And in the last about 10 years, I devoted much of my time to the carbon pricing issue and providing reports and analysis on this item. So before turning the floor to the two panelists, Richard Clark and Professor Kichauchu, I would like to share some background information with you to the condition that I can share my screen I don't know if you can see my screen.
Yes.
Yes. So it should move to full screen. And I would like to go to the start. So the start is really the title. As a reminder, what's the status of world CO2 emissions in the recent years? And what you can see here, which was already said, is that carbon emissions reduced slightly in Europe. They remained more or less even in the US. On the opposite, there has been a big surge in China and a regular surge in so-called other countries. And therefore, I think we all welcome the recent announcement of the Chinese president to try to stabilize these emissions, reduce them, and reach carbon neutrality by 2060, because these countries are and the US are the big issue. Here is the share of these emissions, where again you can see that countries under development plus China plus India, they account for more than 2/3 of the emissions worldwide. Now, what's the status of carbon markets? On this slide, you can see that there has been a lot of progress in recent years, and in green are countries or regions where there is already a trading market, or there is a firm decision to implement a trading market. And there are more and more green countries. Blue countries are countries where there is taxation, which is effective. Now, what, and it will be the first issue, how can we embark the other countries or other regions to also put in place a carbon market and a trading system? First issue. Now, on this, it is not enough to see where there are carbon markets, but it's very important to dig in a little bit and discuss the price of CO2 on these different markets.
And here there is an interesting figure provided by the French Treasury, where there is here in abscissa the share of domestic emissions subject to carbon pricing, and on the other side, the carbon pricing level in dollars per ton of CO2. And yes, indeed, there are markets, more and more markets where carbon is capped and traded. But for some of them, it is at a very low price and below $10 per ton. And it is a second issue. How are these countries going to evolve and reach higher levels where the emissions emissions would be more effectively cut? And let's take a look to recent changes. I guess most of you are familiar with the rapid rise of the EU emission trading system, which this is the curve as of today. So it is, as we speak, a little bit above $50 per 50 euros per ton, I mean, but it even jumped, rose nearly up to 56, 57 euros, starting from a past value those last years in the range of 20, 25 euros. So at this level, the system starts to become effective. Now, let's also share with you the very recent information coming from Germany. And in addition to the European system, Germany has extended its national emissions trading system, which covers all distributors of energy, which covers petroleum, oil, gas, etc. And it starts relatively slowly, but they plan to have it increasing year over year until more than 55 euros in year 2026. And there has been a recent forecast or analysis made by a UK company, Cambridge Econometrics, which concludes that in case Europe is serious with its net zero objective, the carbon price should be in the range of 180 euros per ton in year 2030 and continuing to rise. This is consistent with what was developed by the French strategic organization, strategic and planning organization, which considers that carbon price should be in the range of 2,050 euros per ton in year 2030 and continue to rise until the very high price of nearly 800 euros per ton in year 2050. So this, of course, opens two questions, and I will end here, leaving the floor to the other panelists. The first question is, how is it possible to harmonize? What I show is that we have carbon prices which are very different from country to country, very different from region to region, where more or less all share the objective of net zero, and therefore they should all have the same perspective for carbon pricing. So how is it possible to converge? And second, how is it possible to get it accepted? because at the end of the day, somebody has to pay. And this somebody is the end user. And we, particularly in France, we know quite well what happened when the government increased the taxes on oil, gas, etc., up to 50 euros per ton. That is well below what would be necessary. It was the so-called yellow jacket demonstrators. So, to conclude, I see three major questions. How can we embark all countries over the world in this direction? How can we converge with a unified level of carbon price? And finally, how can we get it accepted by the population? This being said, thank you very much. And I give the floor to the other panelists, starting with Richard Clark. So Richard, you have the floor.
Vignon, thank you very much. And thank you to Fabrice and Isabel for organizing this. I have some slides, but I think I'm just going to talk through it briefly and mention that I was formerly the director of Predictability Limited, which was set up to investigate the question of extreme weather events and the amount that climate change was affecting that. And I'm now senior advisor for climate in the climate and ESG solutions at Ortec Finance. And in that role, I have been responsible for translating the knowledge that predictability gained in insights into the number of disasters that are happening, which is partially to do with urbanization, but of course also climate change increasingly. And these are now embodied in products that Ortec Finance now puts in the climate space. My work has been thoroughly written up in this book called Predicting the Price of Carbon, How to Obtain Climate Change for Good. And with that in mind, I would just like to say a few things about what we have been doing in carbon pricing, a new way of looking at this, and in particular about how to make it equitable and fair. So Vignon has mentioned some of the participants in carbon pricing and of course some of the problems in carbon pricing at the moment. The real challenge of carbon pricing is to keep us on the Paris 1.5 degree pathway to avoid costly decarbonization, to help us make more rational decisions, but of course to avoid the climate catastrophe. So we see great success in many big carbon pricing schemes like the EU ETS. It's amazing that it's 50 euros a ton now. There are side effects. I read this morning that Spain is trying to curtail the windfall taxes of nuclear and hydro that of course have benefited as low carbon producers. And we see other carbon markets in China emerging. And of course, there is the social cost of carbon too. And taxation, as we have mentioned. So it is in the context of the social cost of carbon that I want to say a few words. What we are determined from our work in predictability is that it's possible to create a relationship between the cumulative cost of climate damage to economies from climate change and relate that to the cumulative carbon emissions. This is what we call our cumulative carbon price. And in the book, it's just a very simple equation, and it's about $11 a ton. So we know that that is not in itself going to move the dial. We need something more potent than that. Even on a one-year basis, it's only $21 a ton. So the problem we have is to translate the losses at a global scale and to understand how this is potentially going to affect economies, because the rate of climate losses in total globally is increasing faster than the global economy. And that was before the pandemic. So if that continues, we will see weak economies falling by the wayside. So this is in itself a tipping point and a challenge for the global community. But what is important, I think, is to understand that not all countries are in the same position. The United Kingdom, for example, was a very early industrialized country and has proportionately quite high cumulative emissions compared to countries that are still developing. The US and China and Russia, of course, have big cumulative emissions too. So the question is, how do we use that information to create an equitable carbon pricing? We discussed this with a colleague, Anthony Webster, in a Nature comment article in 2017. Insurance companies should collect a carbon levy. And two issues there came out very strongly. We have what we might call a carbon inheritance, but we also have, that is a GDP, that is all our economies, but we also have a carbon liability, which is the great cumulative load that we have put onto the global ecosystem. So the question is how to combine that knowledge with the global cumulative and country level carbon emissions. And it is looking possible that we can combine these two, or that is to say the carbon emissions and the wealth of nations, into the global carbon price. And in doing so, we find some very interesting results, which is that for a fuel like coal, we would expect the UK, Germany, and the United States to have over $100 per ton carbon pricing. In China, it would be something like $20, in India about $10, and for countries, many countries in Africa, just a few dollars. But for each country, the individual carbon pricing could be used not as a revenue, but as an advisory tool in asset management and also in investment. So this is like the social cost of carbon, where, for example, if a state wants to have a nuclear plant or another fossil plant, the social cost of carbon, which is once again revived under the Biden administration, is being used for that purpose. But it's quite a challenging tool to use, and we think that perhaps more simpler tools would be useful. And this is one of the big ideas that predictability has produced. And in doing so, we joined the World Bank's Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition, the CPLC, and some of those ideas were featured in their output and welcomed as innovative ideas about how to carbon price individual countries and potentially sectors as well. So we now have a prototype tool that does this, and as I say, all this information, most of it anyway, is presented in my book, which is the Predicting the Price of Carbon. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for your very interesting comments and innovative ideas, which maybe will be further discussed by Professor xCHANGE. Professor, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It's my great pleasure to join CPC and share some experiences and carbon pricing policy in China. It is well known that after the Paris Agreement, China take many new climate policies in order to realize its NDC target besides its the target of energy intensity and carbon intensity reduction policy, and this energy intensity and carbon intensity reduction target in terms of the whole national and the provincial and industry building, transport, as well as electricity power sectors. All of this is allocated by the central government in terms of its reduction target about the energy intensity and the carbon intensity. This is, I think, the first kind of policies that China government take after the Paris Agreement. And the second is that the central government launched energy standard for the industry sector and product, and also the buildings and transport tools in terms of the energy standard. Besides these two kind of policies after the Paris Agreement, it is very significant is that China start to implement their carbon market policies. Since the November of 2011, China choose 7 provinces and major cities to be their ETS pilots, including Hubei province, where my university located in, and Guangdong province, and the other 5 major cities, including Beijing, Shanghai, Tianjin, Chongqing, and Shenzhen. The 7 ETS pilots start its emission trading since 2013 and 2014. Up to now, in fact, the 7 ETS pilots operate almost 10 years. So the ETS pilots include or covered about 20 sectors by the ETS pilots, and the investors participate in their ETS pilots. Not only their cover their enterprises, a lot of private investors and institute investors participate in their ETS pilots, the 7 ETS pilots, and which covered almost 1 billion tons CO2. Among in terms of the 7 ETS pilots, and the carbon price is between 30 to 50 RMB during the past years. And based on our assessment about the 7 ETS pilots in terms of its emission effectiveness and the whole carbon market efficiencies, in terms of the energy intensity and the carbon intensity and the CO2 emission reduction, all these 3 targets, based on our assessment, the ETS pilots help the local province or cities reduce the energy intensity and the carbon intensity, as well as our carbon emission reduction very significantly. And also, the ETS pilots help the province and the cities which operate the carbon market in terms of the technology, low carbon technology innovation, and carbon finance, carbon finance innovation, it's also very significant. For example, many different the 7 ETS standards, they try to test different carbon finance innovations, including carbon option, future bonds, fundings, trust, and so on, and mortgagers from the bank loan, and so on. So I think the ETS standards during the past almost 10 years, it's achieved a lot of achievement, and very important is that the local officials and the local enterprises, and as well as the private investors, they understand the carbon pricing more and more compared with the other local regions without the ETS standards. And also the basic ability buildings in terms of the carbon market among the 7 ETS standards is much stronger than the other provinces and cities without the ETS standards, I think. So that's why, based on the almost 10 years ETS standards, the whole national carbon market start since 2017, and will formally start its trading in the 22nd of this month. That means after 20 days later, China's national carbon market will start its trading officially, formally. I think this is a very big, things in terms of the carbon market, even not only in China, it's also in the global, because as the former two speakers mentioned, China's, the emission, CO2 emission is the first one, the biggest one in the world. And if China can use their carbon pricing policy tools successfully to control the CO2 emission and reduction, I think which will set a very good examples for the other countries, especially the other developing big CO2 emitters countries can adopt their carbon pricing policy tools, which will give a lot of experiences. And it can show that not only the developed countries such as European Union and the United States can use carbon pricing policy, it's also in the developing countries can also use the carbon market or carbon pricing policies successfully. I think this is very significant for the global deal with climate change, and also contribute to the agreement Paris, especially the 6 provinces, which is about the market mechanisms, how to develop and try to use the market mechanisms in the old countries based on the Paris Agreement. In terms of the carbon accounting, China carbon market, both the ETS standards and the national carbon market, because we cover the companies and accounting the carbon emission quantities not based on the product level, we based on the company level. So our carbon accounting, of course, include double accounting, because our carbon market, not only the ETS standards, but also the national carbon market covered direct and indirect emissions. That means not only the fossil fuel emission and production emission, it also it covers the companies who which use the electricity, which is indirect emissions. We hope we can control and try to push all the industries and the sectors, no matter you are the direct emission or indirect emission. We try to cover that in our carbon market. And I think this is a very stronger carbon market policy in China, because it's cover the direct and indirect and including the double counting. That's my want to share with you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. It's always very interesting to listen to reports about your very important country, which will have a leading role in this endeavor. As we have a couple of minutes left, maybe I would like both of you to provide your final comments and maybe focusing on what should be done urgently and not left to a long-term future, or differently said, what do you expect from the COP26 conference in Glasgow, and how do you think it could improve the acceptance of carbon pricing? Richard?
Vignon, yes, indeed. The COP26 conference is looming large on the horizon now, and I hear talk that one of the big goals that they hope to achieve is to get a global agreement on no more coal investment and no more coal-fired power stations, because in the electricity sector, that is the biggest contributor to carbon emissions, and there are so many alternatives now. Of course, people talk about natural gas, but in my view, that needs to go to hydrogen solutions. But renewable energy, the price there has come down so much that it's impossible to ignore that option. But what I think is necessary is, although the options are available, it is now time to give investors and markets the signals and the push and the regulations, whatever the actual carbon pricing mechanism is, to say that is the way to go, and this is the cost of not going in that direction, so that it's very clear that we are able to go in the right direction towards more renewable electricity, but of course renewable primary products that we've mentioned before, like steel as well. So that's my hope for COP26.
Thank you very much. Professor Qichao-Chu, would you like to make some concluding remarks along the lines I introduced?
Okay, thank you. Yes, in terms of the 2016, I think with the China national carbon market start after 20 days later, we hope the carbon price can increase stably, and the national carbon market can cover more and more sectors, and the carbon price can increase reasonably, and then based on the reasonable carbon price, which can push the fossil users decrease its fossil energies and try to use the renewable and cleaner energies, which can help to improve energy structures. I think this is the carbon price will play a very, very important role, which can balance the relative price between the fossil energies and the renewable energies. If the carbon price is higher enough, which can increase the price of the fossil energy, and the comparative advantage of the renewable energy will be accepted by more and more enterprises and the whole societies, which can improve our energy structures. And also, the private investors will actively participate into the carbon market, which will help the carbon market liquidity and finally help to form the reasonable carbon price. This is a very important thing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting. I think we are getting to the end of this session. Since we are still at the beginning of this conference, it's hard to draw any conclusion. The conclusion will build up progressively through the next sessions, and therefore I will leave it here and give the floor back to Fabrice.
Ok, c'est à nous. Il faut que je passe à l'antenne, les gars. Yes, hi everyone. Thanks a lot, Dominique Vignon, for having moderating this first session series dedicated to carbon pricing and carbon markets, sharing the point of view of a China perspective and also a UK perspective, and broadly that you have set the scene, Dominique Vignon, dear Dominique Vignon, on the work and the task that probably all Academy of Technologies, all Academy of Science could take their part to help the society at all, and indeed the civil society, better understanding this. And before going in the next panel, that I would like also to thanks a lot all our sponsors who are there. So I'll let you also see all the people and the organization who support this specific conference with platinum level, silver level, and indeed on the bronze level, and all the partners who make this conference happen. I'm going to moderate the next panel dedicated in the directly connected topics, which is all about net zero, carbon neutrality. So I will keep also you, Dominic, in this session, and welcome Satish Kumar Gupta, member of UNFCCC, international expert on carbon offsettings and reduction scheme, former deputy executive of Bureau of Standard in India. So very pleased to have you, Satish, on this specific session. We keep also the line with Professor Chaozhou Chi to highlight us after the great engagement in the United Nations last September 2020 by China to announce to the world his great plan to be net zero in 2060. So behind this, there is many transformation, and we could learn a lot from the Chinese policy to make it happen. I would like also to welcome Dr. Johan Nylander from Stockholm. He is a senior advisor on climate policies and carbon markets, now independent consultant advisor for organization. So welcome you also, Johan, from Stockholm. We would like also to welcome some people who are still connected, and we're going to make it as soon as possible and jump directly in the discussion. So to set the scene in this specific topic about carbon neutrality, how can we move forward from pledges to practice? There is very few standards to say how to become net zero, how to become carbon neutral, and what is the concept, what is the implementation behind the concept, behind the scientific purpose. That is all about in this session. Translate the concept in practice. And the pathway to make it are very different. It depends on your background activities, on the region, on your own mixed energies, and to keep in mind that there is one thing. We can't deal with net zero in a single part of the world. We can't deal to be net zero itself for a company or itself for a territory. It's coming to converge not only the point of view, but the ways to be net zero. That is all about. I would like to start first to introduce Mr. Satish Gupta from India to present yourself very briefly, just 30 seconds and 1 minute, just to say to the world your background, and next jump in the first, we can say, bullet points that we would like to address.
Thank you, Fabric, for giving me the opportunity to join CPC. At the same time, you already introduced me as a UNFCCC member, CDM accreditation team, which was responsible for competence verification of DOEs, designated operational entities, which have been already in frame, and then they are given a certified emission reductions. They have been responsible for certified emission reductions in CDM. I think I'm audible. I'm audible to all of you, please. I think my sound is clear, no?
Yes, yes.
Hello?
Yes.
Hello?
Yes, hello?
No.
We hear you, Satish.
Okay. I should continue. I should continue with my presentation. I am a man of standards. For the last 30 years, I've been working into the Bureau of Indian Standards. That's the national standard body of Government of India. And from there, I took a clue that, there is a adequate work to be done pertaining to the climate aspects, climate reduction, mitigation kind of things. So I became a member of UNFCCC CDM accreditation team for competence verification of DOEs who are responsible for certified emission reductions kind of criteria over there. So here there was an opportunity to audit at least 4 DOEs at different international level. I was a member of international community for UNFCCC. At the same time, then I took an opportunity to be a member verifier for airport carbon accreditation, which is responsible for many of the airports internationally for their level of accreditation, right from starting from mapping, offsetting, reduction, and then transformation. Then I became a member of CORSIA, Carbon Offsetting International Aviation, Carbon Offsetting and Reduction in International Aviation, that is CORSIA, and a verifier for EU MRV regulations for GHG emissions from maritime. Not only that, after that, the Initiative for Climate Action Transparency, they made me a member for their working group for their verification part on the transparency of the NDC's documents which are coming from all over the world to them. So it came into my mind that transparency in NDC documents and the data which is being given to UNFCCC and all kind of pricing mechanism, whether it is a data which is verifiable, the data which is given to them is transparent, it is accountable, and whatever data is coming to them is pertaining to a particular standard. ISO has already published many standards in the series of ISO 14064. Part 1 is basically for quantification and reduction of GHG emissions. So I don't know whether many of the pricing market is considering those standards while calculating this actual carbon mitigation quantification on their part. But at the same time, it's the right time that we approach the ISO documents, not only for quantification and reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. We always refer to many other standards, which are product standards like ISO 37161, which is for smart community infrastructure. And there is a sustainable standards for even for solar heating, 9459. We mentioned about renewable energy being substituted by a fossil fuel energy. There also we have a standard available, ISO standard. ISO 2794914 is about CO2 capture. So all these standards are available. In ISO, there is a practice of voting whenever they make any clause pertaining to a particular kind of activity or the product kind of thing. They always vote in terms of and while taking a decision. But in India, we have a consensus approach. Whoever is participating in our standard formulation activity, we see that there would be a consensus among all the stakeholders. Likewise, I would like to mention here is in our carbon pricing mechanism, which is globally applicable. I think the net zero, which is 2050, a global consensus is coming up saying that there would be a net zero by 2050. Here, it would be better if we take the carbon pricing mechanism as in a consensus basis. I mean to say that there are many countries, there are many developing countries who would be appreciating the idea for not for a long-term plan, but for a short-term plan, let's say for 5 years or 10 years, because to achieve a short-term plan, it is always better to achieve that short-term plan, because we don't know how many of us will remain in another 30 years and for what we are going to leave for our next generation, which kind of sustainable kind of thing would be there. So it's a right kind of approach if we make a short-term plan and stick to that, and our carbon markets or carbon pricing mechanism is depending on the short-term plans out of those long-term plans. At the same time, there is a need to leave the challenging part on each and every country, because all countries, they have a different kind of challenging roles to play. They have some kind of social obligations with them. They have to provide education, health, and everything to all of their consumers. And we should see that how much intensive the carbon pricing is there. We cannot have the same kind of carbon pricing mechanism for all the countries taken together. There would be some countries who will be preferring the carbon pricing at a lower level, and they will be giving importance. Of course, importance has to be given, but at the same time, there would be it should be a country-specific mechanism for carbon trading or carbon market thereof. So at Apex level, I agree that there can be a guidelines published by a uniform approach through international standards globally, through regulations which are coming in place to different countries. But at a country level, if we see that there are many challenges and the distribution of this carbon pricing, I should say this is a carbon liability rather. The carbon liability should be fixed at the individual country level, and then it should be equitable and it should be fair. It should be, the role should be given to each and every country that they are equitable and they are very much fair to that kind of thing. So here, I am not here to advocate this thing, but at the same time, it is our consensus approach which will help us in arriving at a decision about carbon pricing mechanism thereupon.
Okay.
Coming to the ETS EU ETS scheme, there we have to see that many other sectors like marine sectors, aviation sectors have been left out. So in ETS scheme, if they include those two sectors, at EU level, so it would be nice enough for them to go for this. So each and every country has they are limited resources, they have a limited kind of thing. But as far as our country is concerned, we have been, we have a national mission on climate change, which is, operating since 2012. And under that mission, we have many other, many, subheads under that like energy efficiency drives are there. And in energy efficiency drives, we have many sectors, many sectors like cement, steel, all industry, which are having more intensive kind of energy consumption. They have been set some targets over there, and internally we have performed achievement rate scheme, which is equivalent to that carbon trade scheme, and already that is in existence for the last 6 or 7 years. Effectiveness is quite great, and here there are many other things which would be taking place globally, and in India we would be able to achieve by 2030 much of our targets in advance. So though we don't want to make any commitment right now, but here there are likely chances that we would be meeting our targets before the timeline is there 2030. So please.
About your already track record, your achievement for airplane transport and maritime implementation, how can we not only offset the carbon emission, the massive carbon emission by those industries, but also to find a way and to raise up, to incentive the new standards, not only to be a constraint for the players, but also to help them transforming when they have the carbon in the core business. It could be tricky for them with millions of employees behind those industry. So it could be painful if the transformation is too how can we say, too deep in a very short term. So standardization is very important. Convergence towards standardization is very important. I would like to let the floor to Johan Nylander to bring back also from Asia to an EU or Sweden perspective or reverse. Johan, probably yes, just introduce you briefly before and share with us what you've seen in the scene.
Thank you, Fabrice, and thank you to you and Sophie and the others for organizing this. It's a pleasure to be part of this panel. I would like to bring out a little bit about the net zero targets and their relation to the Paris Agreement, and then a little bit about the role that carbon pricing can play to achieve net zero targets. So just to raise a little bit of a concern first, and that is that we all know that the Paris Agreement states that we should achieve a balance between emission sources and removals by the second half of this century. And obviously, carbon pricing is going to be a help in that, and I'll come back to that. But the there will also be quite a demand for removals to achieve this balance for the remaining issues. And I think one of the challenges here will be to understand what the different organizations, companies, but not least the countries, to what extent they will account for removals in their objectives. And I think that there's can become a difficulty when we're trying to aggregate this and to see assess this against the Paris Agreement objectives. And of course, the question sooner or later is going to be who will actually be able to claim all these removals. So they said, for instance, when approaching 2045 or 2050, countries are preparing their nationally determined contributions, and they will probably also account for removals to achieve net zero targets. What will be the space for other actors to claim removals at the same time? And this issue also becomes clear if you want to use carbon offsets for your net zero climate neutrality targets. Again, countries with ambitious nationally determined contributions, will they be able to issue and export climate carbon credits, carbon offsets to other actors when they at the same time need all the emission reductions they are making to reach their own targets? So that's just to raise this question. And I think in relation to Paris Agreement, we have what is called a global stocktake. And this is an opportunity for countries to come together and look at their joint efforts to see and how we are reaching the Paris Agreement target. And it's been raised by several that this is going to be tricky because countries have different targets and they will report a little bit differently and with in perhaps with different types of updates. And if we are to assess net zero targets as well and the progress against this may be even more difficult. So this is first just raising a question or an issue about how we deal with the net zero targets in relation to the tracking of progress against the Paris Agreement objectives. But the key here is, of course, carbon pricing. So I'll come back to that. And I think that net zero targets, to set these, could be relatively simple compared to implementing them. And this is, of course, because many of these targets are set quite long-term, 2050, even 2060. At the same time, we know that the Paris Agreement requires quite urgent action. So in this respect, I think the carbon pricing will play a very important role. At the same time, we hear arguments that carbon pricing is perhaps mainly about cost efficiency, etc. So it will not provide the transformation that is required. This could very well be true at the end of the day, but I think there's two factors that we need to look at in this case. And first of all is, of course, that carbon pricing is part of a policy package. So like any other one policy, it will not alone drive transformation. The second point is that to what extent carbon pricing instruments will be transformative has to do with political decisions. I mean, you can have an ETS imposed by a government that is quite aggressive in gradually putting more stringent caps. But at the same time, if a government does this, it has to be able to take the consequences of that as well. And this leads me to two observations that I will go through quite quickly. The first is that I think that as carbon pricing has to be more transformative, it will have more impacts on society. And this will increase or enhance the debate on how to use the revenues from carbon pricing. So I think it's easy when talking about carbon pricing to start to look at the different design elements. I think the discussion in the future more and more will be about how we use the revenues to create a just transition and to balance the impacts of transformation. The second observation is that this will vary very much between countries. And as Fabrice mentioned, I'll just very briefly juxtapose the EU and Southeast Asia, which is a region I've been working a little bit in. And to take an example, we have EU and its member states. We have a tradition of environmental legislation, high level of taxation in many countries. We have a liberalized electricity market, access to emission reduction technologies, opportunities to switch from coal to gas, solar power in Southern Europe, wind power in North and Northeast of Europe, knowledge and money to do waste incineration, etc., etc. So maybe not the emission trading scheme in Europe maybe was not that ambitious from the start, but certainly is now, and it has been implemented quite quickly and without quite a lot of opposition. If we look at other regions, if, for instance, in Southeast Asia, there are very different situations. The electricity markets are regulated. There's limited or no capacity to manufacture and develop renewable energy. There is not very much tradition of having, for instance, solar power at the utility level and make good earnings out of that. So, and here I will exaggerate a little bit, but just to show how carbon pricing needs to be part of a policy package. I mean, in a region such as Southeast Asia, a country may have to look at when it introduces a carbon price, and if this is strong in the beginning, it may lead to that coal plants have to shut down, and even coal mines reducing their business or closing. And this will mean loss of jobs, losses of incomes for households, both in the plants and the mines. It may lead to less power, electricity into the national grid. At the same time, the country would need to increase the share of renewables. It may need to import technology. It may need to modernize the electricity grid. It may need to build capacity to develop and manufacture renewable energy technology. It needs access to balancing power and storage, etc. At the same time, risks of electricity prices rising and gas prices also rising. You put this carbon pricing will become quite tangible for a large part of society. So in this context, carbon pricing is not enough. A country may have to look at its trade policy, its foreign investment policy, its R&D policy, its electricity market regulations, educational system, many things. And I'm not saying this to scare someone off to do carbon pricing, but I think the importance here that if carbon pricing is to achieve the transformation, it really has to be strong, and that will have impacts on society.
Yes, thanks Johan, for sharing this. It's all about a fair transformation by implementing those policy. And we know here in France that a fair transformation towards carbon pricing, toward carbon policy implementation is very, very important. We have to embed also the point that you have highlighted, Johan, is to have a public policy driven on the revenue collected, the tax collected, to move this fund, these public policies in the right direction. It's all about national implementation or geoeconomic zone implementation, I would like to also have the point of view of Mickael Naranjo. Mickael, who is from UNFCCC, who is the program manager of carbon neutrality. Very pleased to welcome a representative of international bodies and to set the scene of what is carbon neutrality, Mickael, on your point of view, and how can we implement it in a distributed way, the best smooth, the best tailor-made to be net zero. Yes, please, Mickael.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are, and thank you for the invitation to join you. Just to clarify, I coordinate the Climate Neutral Now initiative within the UNFCCC Secretariat, also known as the Climate Change Secretariat. And also carbon neutrality is a topic that is wider in the UN system. It's not me or our team defining what carbon neutrality should be or how it should be approached, but it's rather a broader conversation. So to answer your question, what is carbon neutrality? Okay, so this is a very interesting question because different organizations, and allow me 1 second to reduce the noise here, just a second. I hope that helps. So the carbon neutrality and other topics, other definitions around this topic are not universally agreed. So there are still different groups working on defining lexicon around this issue. On the one hand, for example, you have the Race to Zero, which is a campaign led by the Global Climate Action Champions of the UNFCCC. You also have the ISO working on the 14,068 carbon neutrality standard that, of course, has to have its own lexicon. And there are other science-based targets initiative and others working around this. And the definitions are not universally agreed. But in general terms, the consensus that seems to be emerging is when you say carbon neutral, it means that whatever you're talking about, an organization, an individual, an event, etc., is estimating its carbon footprint or GHG inventory. It's acting to reduce it, to avoid emissions. And finally, is compensating the emissions that have been produced with recognized or credible carbon credits. This is the concept or the understanding that seems to be emerging around the name carbon neutrality, which is not the same as net zero, which you might have heard as well. Net zero refers to achieving a real balance between the emissions that we produce and the removals or capture of those emissions. So it would not be enough to compensate with carbon credits from renewable energy, energy efficiency, or other types of projects. You would need to compensate them or actually neutralize them. It's the word that is being used. Really neutralize them, but by capturing an equivalent amount of greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. So these are the two main definitions that seem to be emerging for carbon neutral and net zero. Now to the second part of the question on our point of view on this topic, as I say, the conversation is still ongoing and it's a broader conversation even beyond the UNFCCC. But what is clear is we need to achieve global net zero emissions by 2050. This is the goal that it's included in the Paris Agreement, a global balance between emissions and removals of greenhouse gases, anthropogenic greenhouse gases. So that one is clear. At planetary level, by 2050 latest, we have to be net zero. Now, at the level of nations, organizations of different types, ideally, we should also aim to achieve that status of net zero by 2050, so that we are contributing to the global target. But this is a little bit more difficult because you will have organizations and sectors where reducing emissions completely or avoiding emissions completely will be very difficult or will take longer. So there needs to be some kind of allowance for compensation of emissions in this case, neutralization of emissions, capturing emissions elsewhere to compensate for the emissions that these organizations and sectors will not be able to avoid possibly by 2050. So in practice, what we need then is to develop technological solutions to capture CO2 and potentially other greenhouse gases as well, directly at the point where they're being generated, or to extract them from the air. And these technologies are still not widely available and definitely not commercially feasible. And so we need to work a lot in developing them and making them economically feasible, economically attractive. Finally, nature-based solutions are also part of the equation. Protection and restoration of ecosystems of all kinds, both ocean ecosystems, forests, etc. This is key, not only because of the climate impact, but also because of the enormous biodiversity loss that we are seeing today, which is also unprecedented. But nature-based solutions alone will not suffice, will not be enough to ensure this global balance of emissions. And so we need to, yes, work to protect and restore all kinds of ecosystems, but in parallel, we need to promote the development of these negative emissions or CO2 capture technologies. Yes, and with that, back to you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Miguel, for sharing this overview, insight, and the way to implement the policies, and also the diversity of initiatives who are very flourishes. Now it's all about how can we converge. It's like an open do tank. Let's say an open do tank to match two things, like a race, and like to find his own way to be net zero. So let's back now to Dominique Vignon, from the French Technology Academy. According to your first introduction, Dominique, and to highlight the update carbon pricing strategy for higher carbon price. Now, when it comes to be net zero, do you think, Dominique, that carbon pricing policies is directly connected to a net zero policy? And what could the academy provide for the society to better understand? When it comes with the society, it comes from decision makers to the civil societies.
Well, thank you very much, Fabrice. It's a good question, which to some extent is a continuation of what Miguel just said. And let me first emphasize that net zero requires, as it was said, direct air capture. There are not enough natural sinks, as was said, and there are sectors which are very difficult to fully decarbonize, or even they are impossible. There is not only cement or steel where hydrogen can play a role, but an important sector which is often forgotten is aviation. There is a project for developing an hydrogen aircraft by Airbus, by the Airbus group. But when you look to the challenges, it is not really achievable. And even if it would be achievable, it will come too late because there is a need for developing prototypes, setting up a completely new infrastructure in the airports, etc., etc. And when you do the planning for such development, it will not come long before 2050, maybe in 2045. So, other things have to be done for those sectors, and the only possibility at the end of the day is offsetting the carbon emission with capture, either at the source, but unfortunately also with direct air capture, which means that it is expensive. It will be expensive. And this is not commonly said. I live in a country where the mood is let's go to the ecology transition. It will be it will create jobs and it will not increase costs. And this is not true. It will increase costs. We have to face it. And if the economies, the various economies which are in competition do not go at the same path, at the same speed, and here I mean typically the French and German economies, if one is doing big efforts when the other one is not only claiming to make efforts, it will impede the respective competitions. It will influence the respective competition between countries. When you see a country like our neighbor who plans to keep its coal plants open until 2038, that is 12 years before 2050, there is something which does not work. There is no adequacy between statements and speeches on one hand and the reality of the policies. So, Fabrice, you asked me what the academic world, of course, including universities, but also academies like ours should do. We should say the truth. The truth is that it has to be done and it will not be easy to do. And we have to face the challenge and we have to tell the stakeholders that it will not be easy.
Thanks, thanks, Dominique, for sharing this insight. And now we are going to be back to and welcome Richard Ovit. Richard, he is a former EU member during 22 years, representing UK, driving forces for sustainable Europe. And Richard is also the former chairman of International Integrated Reporting Council, dedicated a task force to converge the first layer of the convergence from the financial reporting, usually drive for all companies, to a sustainable reporting, let's say an integrating reporting, matching the CSR, corporate responsibility, social and responsibility in the same piece. This is the same task, in fact. Why making those in silo? You drive a lot in this field. We don't say those fields, but in this field, there is just one scene to set and to match the good piece together. Richard, we would like to highlight the regulation framework, the policy framework to be net zero. We have to communicate. Communication is a great tool, but let's use communication also first in the right direction when it comes to net zero. Not only pledges, but implement the good policies, because time is running. Yes. So please, Richard, let's introduce yourself briefly, and we will welcome you to share your point of view, your overview.
Well, good morning, Fabrice. Good morning to everyone. And I'm so proud to be part of this carbon pricing conference, getting the carbon price right and properly inserted in the system, recognising the importance of climate tech solutions is all absolutely integral to us being able to meet the net zero targets, and I'm delighted to bring my own contribution and expertise, but also to listen and to be part of a conference which is very much about driving forward our collective efforts in this field. As you mentioned, Fabrice, I had the honour of leading the International Integrated Reporting Council, this movement that is trying to bring sustainability reporting and financial reporting together for business, but not just together, to make it genuinely integrated, to understand that everything we do in business, everything that we do that has financial consequences, has consequences for the planet, for the environment, for biodiversity, and for other, what we call multiple capitals too. And we stand at a moment of great opportunity, because the European Union today is updating the directive that I'm associated with, the Non-Financial Reporting Directive. Already, since that was passed in 2012, we've seen probably nearly 12,000 companies across the whole of the European Union report on their social and environmental impact, who had not been doing so at all before. It was, I hope and believe, a huge step forward. But I would be the first to accept that they also had huge shortfalls. It was a first attempt. It was innovating new ground. And we're now in a position where the climate emergency is even more urgent and perceived to be so. We're now in a situation where investors are demanding more and better information from companies on their environmental impact. And we're now in a situation where many in business themselves, many people in the audience for this conference, want to achieve a net zero target, want to achieve sustainability strategy, and are much more ready to support systems, including at the level of the European Union, for us to be able to do so. And so a new corporate sustainability reporting directive draft has been published by the European Commission within the last month. And I'm still privileged to be working in an advisory capacity on what that directive might say when it comes out of the European Parliament and the European Council, and in relation to new standards that for the first time are going to be associated with the directive, including standards on carbon itself. So these are very, very exciting moments. We've had 1,000 companies worldwide that have now made net zero pledges. Again, many in this audience. But what we've seen is that there is still a gap between those pledges, whether they're by countries or by companies, and how they are, the strategies of how they are to be enacted. So the European differences are going to ensure that now there will be alignment between what companies are asked to report on and the policy goals of the European Union itself, its Green Deal, and in particular the 1.5 degree target coming from the Paris Agreement. And we're also going to see that the reports by companies for the first time are going to be verified. There's going to be an independent audit procedure. And I see this as a potential major step forward within the next 2 years. And lastly, this, Fabrice, in these introductory thoughts, regulation has its part to play, and I'm happy to discuss that with you and with my fellow panelists. But regulation only comes because there are demands from society, and good regulation only comes if it is effective. It actually makes a difference within the real world. And part of my contribution to this conference is also to talk about the politics of carbon and of climate change, and some of the difficulties that we had at the level of the European Union to get a good consensus, some of the opportunities now that we have to get a better consensus, and also looking at a conference which is primarily to a European audience, understanding that potential that we have with the huge movements in China, whatever people's views about the politics of China, and I have strong criticisms, I promise you, but China has moved immensely in terms of the climate change agenda. And now we see a change of policy in the United States too, in relation to coming back into Paris and potentially also moving on regulation on the sustainability performance of the company and the reporting of it. And so what that gives us is a huge global opportunity, Europe, India too, China, the United States, to get this agenda not just leading within the European Union, but across the whole of the globe. And the politics of that is something that excites me too. Fabrice.
On also an Asia-China perspective with Professor Jouzel. I do appreciate your perspective and the, how can we say, the best way to join forces, not only within a country or geo-economic zone, but to be inspired by different ways to be net zero. I would like now, yes, Professor Jouzel to, can we say, share a piece of work, or let's say a piece of your great work that you accomplished and already done, and all the, also the programs that you are in charge by through China regions, preparing this specific session. You mentioned that there is different pilots in China, and the different pilots inspire themselves in those regions. So this diversity is already done in China, and I would like probably, yes, to share with all of us your point of view now. China is going to run his net zero plan, and let you the floor to present the point you would like to address.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. It's my great pleasure to share in terms of the China's carbon neutral target and what actions now China is doing. First of all, in last September 22, President Xi Jinping announced China will try to realize the carbon neutral target before 2060. And after the announcement, China's central government firstly do a lot of actions in terms of the top level design in terms of the carbon neutral target. It's for example, it's strategy and roadmap and so on. And since this year, the local government required by the central government, every provincial government, every major city government now is doing their best to design their roadmap and their action plan in terms of how to realize the carbon neutral target. And every ministries and sectors and bigger companies, especially the state-owned companies, is also doing their best to design their planning and their project and action, and especially roadmap in terms of their carbon neutral. Yeah. And this is the first of all in terms of the carbon neutral action in China. And secondly, recent 3 months, the very hot topic or words in China is carbon neutral. Almost everyone, every institutes, they will talk about the carbon neutral. We have a joke that when friends meet, the first word is that carbon neutral. How about your carbon neutral? So I think this is a very, of course, it's a very good situation that more and more Chinese people and government, they pay more attention about the carbon neutral and carbon reduction, and they try to take some actions. This is the first of all. And the measures such as the TV, newspaper, website, and internet, all of these measures, they take actively actions to try to report about the carbon neutral concept, actions, and the universities and their how to say and some institutes, they organize a lot of forums, conference meeting, and so on to discuss about the carbon neutral. So this is a very hot topic in China now. And of course, China realized its carbon neutral target before the 2060 is a very big challenge for China, because it's very heavy economic structures and energy structures. So that means China must pay a lot of cost, at the very high cost, to transform from the high carbon economic structures and energy structure to the low carbon structures. That means the whole societies, maybe every people, especially some workers who working in their heavy or high carbon industries, they maybe will lose their job and trying to find a new job in some green or new or low carbon industries or companies. So these are very heavy challenges, and how to arrange their transfer, their job or position from the high carbon industry to low carbon industry. This is a very heavy job because of the huge population of China. And of course, it's a very big opportunities for investment and economic development because of China's huge market and huge economies. So when it's transferred from the high carbon society or economy to the low carbon economy, the demand for low carbon or green investment is very, very huge. I think from my private point of view, since China started its reform and open policy in last century of 18, we have passed 40 years. China achieved a very big economic achievements. And I think the next 40s until 2016 is another new challenge and opportunity for China transfer to low carbon economy. The investment will be very huge. And we think the public finance is very limited. What we need is a huge private investment and market-oriented investment in the low carbon project, low carbon product, low carbon service, low carbon solutions, and so on. So China will provide a very huge opportunities for the global investment. Yes, I think this is not a very good opportunity for China itself, but also for the whole global, especially the European Union, the US, the UK, and the rest of the world. I think in this field, China, between China and the European Union, United States, the UK, because of the European Union and the United States, UK have very advanced innovation, low carbon concept, low carbon innovation of institutions, low carbon technology, and so on. So in this field, we have a big opportunity to cooperate deeply for the carbon neutral. This is my point of view. Finally, I think for China itself, how to realize its carbon neutral target also is a very big challenge. But I think the three key points or factors is very, very important. The first is that the market. If the market, including the carbon market, can provide a very strong demand for the low carbon technology, which will incentive or drive the low carbon technology innovation in China. And also the policy is very important, which will push or encourage the private companies or state-owned companies can invest their long-term R&D or innovation in terms of their low carbon technologies. So the carbon neutral target set a very stable and encouraging long-term target, which will give the investors and companies are how to say the belief and confidence that they can make their demand to invest long-term for their low carbon technology and R&D. So the market, technology, policy, these three factors integrate together will help us to try to realize our carbon neutral target. And in addition, I want to add some words. Because China is a very big country and includes many different regions. The different regions, especially different provinces, their economic structure and restructure, their economic developing stage is very different. So China now is trying to considering for different regions, different local, we will try to use the different policy, different targets to push the different region to realize their carbon neutral target in different roadmap. I think this is very important. We cannot use the very thin standards or very rigid or same policies for the different regions. I think this experience is also important for the global, because of global we have a different countries, different economic structure, energy structure, and developing stages. So we must consider different policies for the carbon neutral target. And finally, our whole global to realize its net zero. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Professor Jouzel Chi, from this China perspective. And we know that the transformation for China is something which is important, and the concept also to take the challenge in the opportunity ways. And there are a lot to do, and a lot also to transform when it comes to China roadmap for low carbon economy. But we are very pleased to also know that China is really engaged in this direction for can we say like an inspiring from own is different regions to inspire itself and inspire probably the rest of all the countries. I would like to welcome now Jean-Florent Elf from S&P. Jean-Florent, he is based in Paris, and I would like to have the complementary point of view, not only a national point of view or a broad point of view from the United Nations, driven by Mickael, to have a private point of view. When it comes to report on net zero target, the investors, the capital markets, the bank and insurance players are also the core engine of the economy. How can they provide the best tools for themselves? And at the end of the day, it will be also the best tool for their asset under management. So I'll let you present yourself, and very pleased to have you, Jean-Florent Elf, as also our sponsor today. So yes, the floor is yours, Jean-Florent.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Fabrice. Hi everyone. We are very pleased to speak today and to give you some more insights. Indeed, we are S&P Global. We are, known as the leading credit rating agency. S&P is 4 divisions: S&P Ratings, S&P Market Intelligence, which is the data provider, and we also have S&P Platts focusing on commodities, and S&P Dow Jones indices. We have now tackled ESG, sustainability, and especially climate very serious.
You're muted, if I'm not mistaken, Jean-Florent.
Yes, so I was saying that we work with both corporations and financial institutions. We actually, focus especially on climate, but also on broader ESG topics. What's challenging those days for our clients who are again financial institutions, governments, or companies, is to find the right metrics, right? To find those standardized, harmonized metrics when it comes to measuring the carbon footprint, measuring net zero targets, measuring carbon price risk exposure, or even physical risk exposure, and so on. And so we, have always been very active in that field. So we actually, try to follow the TCFD recommendations and also the different initiatives in this area, such as, for example, the various net zero initiatives that were out there. And so, for example, if some of you see my screen, you see that you have here the possibility to see a cost to EBITDA ratio. So just to give you an example of what type of metrics are used by both companies and investors, and it's very important that the two speak the same language. Okay, we have embedded the IPCC scenarios, the International Energy Agency scenarios, the so-called Energy Technology Perspective scenarios, ETP, into the assessment. So just to give you an idea, we currently cover approximately 20,000 companies, okay, which represent 99% of global market capitalization. And for each of these companies, we track their carbon price risk exposure in the context of each business activity they operate in and each country they operate in. And we, based on especially IRENA projections, we, forecast a future carbon price exposure to which companies are exposed in 2030, in 2040, in 2050, across several time horizons and across several carbon price scenarios. When it comes to the trajectory of companies, there is, some of you may be aware that there is two groups of sectors, okay? So there is those sectors which are deemed to be carbon intensive sectors and for which there is a decarbonization pathway expressed per unit of production. So for example, utilities, tons of CO2 per megawatt hour, cement, tons of CO2 per tons of cement, and so on and so on. And this is what we call everybody's call the SDA approach, sectoral decarbonization approach. Okay, and in this regard, you have what I'm showing you, by the way, is the ERAF report. You have several types of sectors falling in there. So what I'm saying is that what we see ongoing now is that when investors and financial institutions want to measure the trajectory of the portfolio, they tend to have a multi-sector approach, meaning that they want to capture the trajectory of those big sectors with high carbon intensity, such as automobiles, utilities, steel, cement, airlines, as well as the other sectors, because there are more and more companies across all the sectors that publish targets. And because the big challenge nowadays is to rely on the targets set by companies, and those targets, even though they could be SBTi certified, they could be in different units. Okay, they could be in absolute terms, in intensity terms, and therefore we have to harmonize that. And in the absence of targets, we can even look at the capex. So there is a lot going on, especially since 3 years, in the development of such metrics. Especially in Europe, but also in Japan, for example, GPIF publish, the Japanese pension fund publish such results. More and more institutional investors across the world actually show their climate trajectory. Some of them show their carbon price risk exposure or even physical risk exposure. And so we really are in a very interesting phase where everybody is trying to speak the same language, to measure things in following the same metrics or indicators.
Florent, for sharing this perspective. I would like to ask you, yes, let's say by your side, Jean-Florent, and then turning to all our panelists, from decision makers, that it means from boardrooms, and when it comes to civil society implementation, let's call it like a board of the street. How can we manage the implementation from the boardrooms to the board in the street, that is, means the civil society, and reverse? What could be the governance, the good balance, not only by being net zero, but by taking the right decision to be net zero? In the one side, there is commitment, we can say sector per sector, with higher standards. And where we were preparing this session, we have highlight also Richard, Ovid, that we have to push the minimum standard higher. And I would like to start with you, Jean-Florent, and with you also, Richard Clark, by this. For a connection to be net zero and carbon pricing, it comes with to have the best equilibrium between corporate, let's say also public institutions, public policies, but at the end of the day, this is the consumer citizen. The carbon pricing is also a part of the consumer citizen. How can we better align a net zero commitment in the two sides of the board, from the boardroom to, let's say, the board of the street or the civil society? For your perspective, Jean-Florent, from a private perspective, and then let's come with Richard Clark to engage more this conversation.
Yeah. So it's very important to re-emphasize the concept and the carbon budget concept, right? So you know there is a defined amount of CO2 that we should not exceed to be in line with the 1.5 degree scenario. And this carbon budget, could be then allocated by sector, and then within the sector by companies, or it could be allocated by country. So it's very important to have that in mind. You know what I mean? To understand the different concepts, indeed. And I would say that. As I said, it's very important to speak the same language between the policymakers and the different stakeholders, companies, industry boards, like you said. And that's why I emphasize the fact that the board members at companies need to monitor, to be able to monitor and report on very harmonized and straightforward indicators, right? So TCFD, for example, has helped the board of directors a lot, right? Because it provided the framework to understand, to make the link between the governance, the strategy, and the risk management and the metrics and targets. So I think following that would be ideal in any net zero let's say initiatives.
Jean-Florent, I agree with you that reporting is absolutely vital. TCFD is a vital tool in this, and the role of the central banks. We've seen activity in Europe and, of course, in the UK too. What we, I think, need most of all is strong and stable carbon pricing mechanisms, which can include ETS and, in some cases, national carbon pricing schemes, but that the movement of the price should be predictable to some extent and stable, that the transition from a low price to a high price should not be something that happens very, very quickly. And I do have some concern, and I think others are feeling this too, that it is, on one hand, excellent that ETS has gone up to 50 euros, but that is also having side effects now that will require other mechanisms to bring in. And that is because we have gone from a very low price of many years at 5 euros to this new mechanism which has delivered a strong carbon price. And if this happens too fast, then it will create secondary problems. I think we also have to realize that many countries are not going to proceed at the same pace. We were hearing a very interesting understanding of the difference, for example, between Europe and Southeast Asia. I agree with that we have very different structures indeed different grids, different capacity and capabilities to implement things. And this requires different carbon pricing, in my view, horses for courses, as we say in England, in order to meet those demands. So it is not necessarily the case, for example, that the decarbonisation immediately goes to zero. What we need to have is countries that have long industrial and high net GDP per capita to start rapidly transitioning out of coal, for example, to allow others that want to develop. Kosovo is an example, so that they have an opportunity to enjoy the economic wealth that many other countries have had. And I think as a chemical engineer, in thinking about these things, one of the concerns that I have, that I see in this movement, is that we are very rapidly saying that fossil fuels have no further role to play. What I would say is fossil fuel emissions have no further role to play, but fossil fuels, particularly natural gas, has great potential, I believe, in terms of hydrogen, both in terms of what they call blue hydrogen, maybe other forms too. And if we can invest and develop those technologies, some of which require carbon capture, then it will give us an easier transition than if we try to immediately all go for renewables in the first step, because I don't think that that's going to happen. And what will happen is we have a very disaggregated global economy, and that will increase tensions rather than reconcile tensions at the moment.
I agree with what Richard has just said a bit about hydrogen, including that, which I think is an essential part of the mix if we're to get to net zero in 2050. And I agree with what you just said about the importance of predictability in the carbon price. But I would say that many analysts say that rather than at 50 euros, that it's probably between 100 and 200 euros if we're going to meet the target. So whilst accepting we need to find a way of getting there in a managed pathway to minimise the negative consequences, I do think that we should note the big chasm there is between where carbon pricing is today, the shortfalls of the European emissions trading system, and I was in the European Parliament when it was passed, so I again fully acknowledge that, as well as where we need to go for the future. Now, Fabrice, our moderator, your original question, I think what you say about the boardroom is really important. What we know from the research in Europe, the Alliance for Corporate Transparency, is at the moment only a minority of companies take their sustainability strategy or even their sustainability report to the board level or have board arrangements for overseeing sustainability issues. That has got to change. If this is as urgent as we all know it is in this conference, then it cannot be relegated to simply being a management issue within the company. And then boards themselves, and by the way, the Mazars board agenda survey shows that a big majority of board members today say that sustainability is an important interest, but also say that it's not well represented amongst board members and that they don't feel they have the skills and competencies to manage it. So that does all need to change. And one more aspect at the board level is that boards need to ensure that the remuneration packages for their executives reflect their sustainability targets. And a number of companies are doing this, but we need to see all companies doing so. And then Fabrice, your question about the population, the citizens, and what's their role in all of this. You know, I'm a big fan of the European standards because they're going to meet overcome a big hurdle in how we make progress, in that they're going to empower and enable investors to really drive change, and companies will listen to what the investors say and will want the better access to capital and the cheaper access to capital that the transition to sustainable finance is representing. But the new standards also have to reflect what citizens want. You know, one of the great principles of integrated reporting is that reports are concise and understandable. And let's face it, the hundreds of pages and the small print in many company reports today do not give genuine access to stakeholders, to citizens. That it's about compliance. Yet, as we know, citizens are investors. The big majority of institutional investment funds are pensions paid for by all of us, certainly within Europe, the vast majority of us again. And what I predict, but also what I hope for in the years to come, is that the new standards, the new forms of reporting, of openness, of transparency about corporate behaviour and sustainability will actually be accessible and understandable and therefore accountable to citizens, and that citizens can easily choose not simply which products they buy, but where their pensions are invested in order to achieve sustainable outcomes. And if we don't do that, we've seen the warning signs in France itself. We've seen the Gilets jaunes. We've seen the pushback on changes that were genuinely intended to meet sustainable goals, but which didn't take the population with them. And therefore, it's important that when we talk in Paris about the concept of just transition, when we talk about the concept that's in the UN is widely referred to as climate justice, that as we plan for this net zero future, as we plan to defeat climate change, that we take populations with us and that we make citizens active in the process by which we do so.
You want me to come in here, Fabrice? If that's the case, I'm happy to do that. And I just wanted to echo what both Richards are saying here. That
yes,
first of all,
sure, Joan, please.
Okay, thank you. That we're seeing a very encouraging global effort, and as I mentioned, Southeast Asia, there are several planned schemes on carbon pricing in those countries. I think, as Richard said, that the expectations on the regarding the pace with which those can deliver in the future, we have to be really realistic about that. But just quickly going back also to the boardroom question, what is coming with the Paris Agreement, which is emphasized very strongly with the Paris Agreement, is transparency. And we see also this as something that is developing in the private sector. So it's more and more transparency, both required by the Paris Agreement, but also bottom up from the private sector. So if we can get a match of communication regarding this transparency, that would be great. For companies to understand their emissions and how they can reduce them and how they can be more energy efficient, etc., is also the basis for their own benefits in participating in carbon pricing schemes. So just one point here is that communication will be very important from both the policymakers' side, but also from the companies. And it's about, and I think there's a few studies now showing these lessons learned, that communicating the benefits, communicating visions of low carbon future, not just communicating we're going to put a price on you, and also communicating to the society that when we get revenues from carbon pricing, we're going to put that back to society. So those parts of communication, I think, will be very important in some sort of exchange between society and private sector and government. So, thanks.
Yes, we are going to bridge all those things that you have tailor-made, each on your side from your backgrounds, when it comes to be transparent or, let's say, accountable between the two boards we have designed, the boardroom of the private sector, let's say also the public sector, and the boardrooms of the consumer citizen. Aligning those three layers in the same layer, in fact, to design or a sort of governance when it comes to be net zero. Do you think that we have to communicate, that you mentioned, Johan, to communicate also from public or private organization on the website of each organization, have to now to go deeper and to be realistic and compatible with the target and what they do by their own strategy, to highlight on their website their carbon footprint. When it comes to be net zero, it's all about to be accountable and transparent. Let's say this as a broad question, an open question to all of you, to say, do you think now it's the time that all organizations have to show up on their website their carbon footprint, that we could monitor, I don't know in the real time, but updating very quickly in each report, to say it's not only about the how can we say the price they have on the market, the stock option, and so on, but to say we are accountable to be net zero. There is another championship today. It's not to have the best price on stock exchanges, is to have the best transparency when it comes to be net zero. And beyond this, there is all the standardization, sector per sector, countries per countries. But now, if we have to set the scene to be practical for the next 2 decades, at least, to transform all our economy, it's very important. So it's an open question, an open discussion, like a due time process. And I will be very happy from all of you to have a word or to send a message or an input on this scheme. Yes, probably. Miguel, do you want to say something? Yes, Miguel.
Thank you. Yes, I actually have to, unfortunately, leave you in a few minutes. So thank you for asking me to go first. Maybe from our side, from the UNFCCC Secretariat side, let's say that the private sector action is something that we encourage and something that we follow on, right? We keep an eye open for what's happening there, and we try to support through different initiatives that we have in place. So private sector action is very important, and it's key to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. That's it. And we are very interested in it. However, the opinion that I express now is it's not an official opinion. It's more the personal opinion on the role of the private sector. And definitely, I think that by this time it is already late. That companies, for those companies that are not reporting publicly on their footprint and on their plans to address that footprint, which is even more important. So I think as a matter of transparency towards the general public, governments, the investors that you have discussed already a lot, the important role they have, it should be already a standard that companies make public completely the information of their footprint, and again, the strategy to address that footprint, ideally also the risks that they see in the transition to whatever they need to change to address that footprint. Again, this is a matter of responsibility that any board of any company should be already addressing with priority. How is climate change impacting or going to impact in the near future your business model, and what are you doing to address it? So yes, I think it's transparency is the key to credibility and to trust. Without transparency, everything else that we do lacks. It's basically useless. It will lack on buying and support. So transparency is key. and definitely companies should be reporting already on this. I think we will see more and more requirements, both official and non-official, to make that information public. But hopefully companies that are already doing it or already preparing to do it will be on a much better position than those that are lagging. We recently saw what happened at Exxon in the election of the board recently. So something like this, so both actions coming internally from the companies and also externally will be forcing companies to present their footprints and their strategies. So yes, with that, again, this is my personal opinion. That doesn't reflect necessarily the opinion of the Secretariat. But with that, I thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you. I need to leave to the next commitment, but we see you in the afternoon for another session.
Exactly.
Thank you for this.
Bye. Thanks, Miguel. See you next. Yes, let's back to this last but not least question. Probably, yes, we shall. We've got some few minutes after to conclude this one series session. But yes, let's run this open discussion on this way. In a very, very short message, I will ask to all the speakers to have a quick analysis, a fast-track analysis on this point. How can we be more transparent from public and private organizations when it comes to be net zero?
I think to your original question, should it be on the website? Yes, of course. You wouldn't expect me to disagree with that as a complete champion of transparency. But of course, that won't be useful unless we can agree standards. Because if for one company it's measured as the company alone, and for another company they do the full value chain, these are not comparable pieces of information. And what we know is that of the top 160 companies that impact upon climate change, that of those, 43% have net zero targets, but only 10% have scope 3 emissions. And that shows why we need to move on comparability as well as transparency. Then we come to, of course, the process of standardization. And it's quite crucial that we get the information right, yes, but it's way beyond Fabrice. I'm much more ambitious than you, if I can tease you in that way, in that I support the European proposals that all of this goes in the company sustainability report for 40,000 plus companies around Europe. And I guess that would be almost every company watching would fall into that category. And that it will be fully digitized and tagged, and that the information will be on the single European portal, which is going to be created for company reporting to make it accessible in terms of the comparison between the reports. And to be honest, folks, that is going to happen. I believe this is going to happen, and that reporting is going to start in less than 2 years from now. So I urge companies to address that if you're not already doing so. And finally, Fabrice, your point about, is it more important to have the high stock price, the high rating on the in relation to the stock exchanges, or the better transparency on carbon? The great thing about the transition to a sustainable financial system, and I know Jean-Florent will absolutely agree with this, is that we're going to do both. And that we now see through the Sustainable Stock Exchange Initiative that exchanges throughout Europe and the world are adopting listing rules on sustainability. We now see the massive growth in sustainability indices like the Dow Jones Sustainable Index that S&P are associated with, in which companies are vying very greatly in order to get themselves up the ranking. And we're going to end that dichotomy between companies believing that they've got to choose between what's sustainable and what is best in terms of maximizing finance, to understand that if they believe in long-term value creation for the company itself, they cannot afford an unsustainable future. And what we say at this conference is they cannot afford an unsustainable present either. I'm back again this afternoon. I'll be listening to my fellow panelists, but thank you for listening to me.
So I would just like to add to that, Richard. The Richards agree again that it's a sustainable index, maybe a sort of a donut economy index of the true impacts and values that a company creates is very, very important. And it's not just the net dollars. The other thing that always strikes me is company reports. They include CSR and so on in their appendices as an additional, as a requirement to reporting, but really like a good newspaper that is telling the truth, that it should be readable, communicatable, and not have this sort of climate department at the very end, but like many newspapers now, they combine climate into every story, whether it is sport or whether it is investment or finance or government. These are activities crossing all the sectors, and I think reporting in that way could be a lot better than it is, and that's really all I have to say.
Fabrice, I'm afraid I have to leave now.
Yes, we are going probably to close in a very, very short the panel and to probably to have your voice, Dominique, about the way to be much more transparent. And
well, to a large extent, I would agree with what has been said by the other panelists, and certainly nobody would disagree for getting more transparency. Nevertheless, I would like to make a warning and not to fall in the trap of name and blame, name and shame. It has been alluded to Exxon. We have the same with Total in France. There are many citizens which are very much criticizing oil companies. But nevertheless, they put oil in their cars and they are buying this oil. So it is too simple to put the blame on the companies. They do what they can. There is not enough infrastructure to convert all the vehicle fleet to electricity. And in many countries, electricity is not decarbonized. So all that has to be done together, and only blaming companies because they have emissions is not an answer.
This double view, it's about not only making some constraint to try to move core business line moves in the right direction, it's also about incentivizing the new sectors to help them take also their part or their piece of market, but it's only about not only about the piece of market, it's about a piece of to be net zero globally. I would like to thank you, yes, Dominique, if you have to leave, but you can stay with us at least for the other session. It's a pleasure to have the French Academy of Technology part of us and a partner also. So thanks again, Dominique. I would like to come with Satish Gupta from this question. Accountability, standardization are not very far. For your side, in a very short perspective, how can you fix the level of the standards we need? I say the standards with an S because we know that there will have, as carbon market price, many kind of carbon markets. So it will also have many kind of standardizations. So when it comes with this, do you think that, and it will be also the question for Jean-Florent to pass the way in this, to be from standardization of industries to standardization of carbon accountability. What could be the pathway from industrial standardizations to standardize the carbon accounting itself?
The question is very much clear to me. Right now, see, the standards which are framed by different countries have a different role to play at different times. So standards do help in making the regulations for a country. For example, there would be some regulations controlling the GHG emissions from country to country, from scheme to scheme, sector-wise also. When these standards are there, the regulations would be in place. And these regulations and policies, for example, climate policy, they will take a help from the standards. And standards are there to guide. So my submission is that before we make anything mandatory, like mandatory declaration of GHG emission or footprint by a company and putting it in the website, let it be a kind of voluntary approach. The regulation should not make it mandatory kind of thing, so that the company are bound to put that kind of thing, because it's a market strategy which will ultimately going to come, and the market would decide which company is having which kind of carbon footprint, and they would like to close those companies which are not declaring their carbon footprint at the website. So it's a right kind of approach that we always consult the standards which are in place. Maybe it's a national standard or international standards, but they should not be a barrier of kind of thing for putting all kind of cap on the system which are in place. So this is my submission. Thank you.
Sharing this, please, I would like to have the Jean-Florent on this question about standardizing the carbon accounting from a corporate perspective.
Yes, it's very important. And actually, so the more we standardize the different metrics to report on, the better, because first, what we have seen in several jurisdictions is that if there is a regulation requiring mandatory disclosure, then we see that the companies or the organizations that are impacted by those regulations start to take actions, start to decarbonize, start to, it has an impact on the performance. So disclosure is a first step towards having an impact. Okay, and yeah, standardization, for carbon emissions, there is already a standard, right, of framework, which is called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which has been used for decades by both investors and companies. Now we need indeed a similar framework for other things, like how to measure the trajectory of organizations and companies, and DCs and several bodies are working on it, especially there's BTI, CDP, WRI, S&P, and other players. So I emphasize the importance of disclosure and the importance of speaking the same language. For environment and climate, we have the chance that we all express things in the same unit, okay, tons of CO2, which may not be the case for other ESG topics. So that's why it's working, but there is still work to be done.
Thanks in the same time all our panelists. We are just some minutes ahead on the timing with this very rich conversation, and probably also to have in a very short also term the China perspective with Professor Chaozhou Qi. It's not only about standardization, it's about also on the process and how we could run or have in common the engineering of the process. it's about timing, it's about also avoiding side effect, and the process and the quality of the process is very important. How can you share with us by a China perspective? And then we are going to close after this very, again, rich panel. Yes, please, Professor.
Okay, thank you. I'm an economics professor, so from the economics theory and our experiences in practice to setting up the carbon market, because the patterns. I think the information transparency is very important for the policy effectiveness and the investment decision, because the information are symmetry and uncertainty. This is a two very important affecting factors in the carbon market and the investor decision. And in terms of the information symmetry in the market, between the local government, between the government and the companies, between the investment and the companies, all of these levels exist. The information asymmetry. So how to deal with the information asymmetry is very important for the carbon market and the carbon price, as well as the policy effectiveness. Just all of the speakers mentioned the information or the emission data transparencies. I think it's very important for the investment, especially the private investment in the company and in the market. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Professor Jouzel for also bring a piece of work and concept and thinking to go ahead in this panel. You have seen, I'm going to close the discussion for this morning series, that carbon pricing, carbon accounting, net zero are all connected directly. So I would like to thank all my panelists, my distinguished panelists for this morning, dedicated to the series 1. We are here in Paris time zone, and we are very pleased to welcome you just in 1 hour at 2.5 p.m. Paris time, and hope that all around the world you have just catch the piece of concept to be net zero, a piece of understanding from a private and the public sector when it comes also with accountability, when it comes with standardization, sector per sector, with a diverse point of view of geographic zone. So thanks a lot, my panelists, for this morning, and let's back this afternoon with another series. Some of you will be there. It will be all around implementing carbon, not only carbon pricing, but the Paris Agreement itself within international trade agreement for a lower carbon footprint on the commerce, international commerce. And we are going to connect this concept also with the back office of the international commerce, which is the supply chain. How having a low carbon supply chain, and it will be very interesting to understand the concept in this angle. So thanks a lot all, and just to have a rest, and let's back on the afternoon. Thanks.
Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you.